I am Daniel Litis, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my regular guest. He is the author of The Servant of the Moon and Sun series, no other than Mr. Joel C. Flanagan-Grannemann.
That's me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, thank you for your time, Mr. Joel. As
Oh,
usual, can you please introduce yourself?
yes, I'm Joel C. Flanagan-Grannemann, as Daniel said. I write the Servants of the Moon and Sun series. It's a retelling, reimagining, loose reimagining of Sleeping Beauty, based on the idea of what if Maleficent was Aurora's mother, and what if she wasn't really evil. So that's where the basic idea came from. I have 3 books right now, working on the 4th and 5th right now, so we're just moving along.
Yes, looking forward for all those series, Mr. Joel. So, what defines fantasy genre in literature?
I think it's there. I mean, there's so many ways you can define it. I think for me, it defines as a secondary world, a different version of the world. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it, and I, it's it's got it's it used to be very, very, very basic. Fantasy was sword and sorcery. It was the D&D books. It was the Forgotten Realms books. But fantasy has gotten to be such a huge genre lately that there's epic fantasy, there's grimdark, there's the romantic fantasy. There's just so many ways you can tell the stories using the tropes and the characters and the settings of fantasy. So it's such a wide open genre now that you can pretty much you can do whatever you want to. You've got your fantasy, your fairy tale retellings. You've got these grimdark, really, really, really gritty stories. You've got these basic cozy fantasies. So it's all over the place, and it's so fun because it's got so many different things you can do in the fantasy genre, and you don't have to there are all these no sword fantasies that are based they're cozy fantasies that there's so many different things you can do, and it's really amazing. It's really opened up the genre to all kinds of different writers who can show take their what their stories are and just put them out there and show everybody what they can do, and not be really held back by simple tropes and simple. You have to have wizards, you have to have swords, you have to have a chosen one sort of story. You can pretty much do whatever you want. You just find that audience that'll love what you do.
So, Mr. Joel, is Servants of the Moon and Sun categorized as one of the fantasy?
It's epic fantasy. It's got elements of epic fantasy because the first book is very much a quest journey story. The second book is more kind of a they're in one area for quite a while, and it touches on kind of a coziness to it because it's very they're very the characters are making a home and making a place of safety for them. Then it really hits into not quite grimdark. It doesn't get that bad, but it gets into the more epic, the more grittiness of fantasy. And then the third book is more of a kind of a siege story because it takes place in pretty much one area. That it's the beginning of the Fairy Civil War, so it's the first few battles that are fought, and pretty much you stay in one area for the whole book for that one.
Very well said, Mr. Joel. So, how does a fantasy novel typically differ from science fiction?
Well, that's a good question. I think it differs in the setting, of course. With science fiction, you've got usually space. You've got either far future or near future, or there's going to be a lot of tech involved. With fantasy, you're going to have tech, but it's going to be magic based. It's fantasy can be in the past, it can be in the future, it can be in a different world. You have all these portal fantasies where, like Narnia, where you're have people from Earth to put it a simple way, go into another world and exploring that world, or you have a world unto itself, like the worlds of Tad Williams, or you go basic Middle Earth Tolkien. So, and then probably the biggest thing about fantasy is there's usually some sort of quest, some sort of thing that the hero has to do, or the group of heroes has to do, usually defeating a big bad or a villain of some sort. But I think that's kind of the basic story, but you can go pretty much anywhere with it.
Definitely. So, who are some of the most influential authors in the fantasy genre?
I don't know about in the fantasy genre, but to my individual genre, Janie Wurst, she's just published the last book in her Swords of Light and Shadow book that just came out today in ebook. But this is one of her earlier books. This is Storm Warden. It's part of the Cycle of Fire series, and it's a trilogy that follows a kind of a how do I describe him? He's a very clumsy. He's very shy protagonist, and he gets caught up in this war between wizards, basically. And there's a quest forced upon him that he has to become this high powered wizard to save himself and save the world. And I think I read these books in Storm Warden. There's Storm Warden. That's the first book. Keeper of the Keys. I probably should slow down. Keeper of the Keys is book 2, and Shadowfane is book 3. And I don't think I'm exaggerating that these books helped get me through high school, because I was that shy, uh, shy kid in high school, and seeing that character grow from being this shy kid who doesn't know anything to becoming um, high powered mage he becomes at the end of book 3, really showed me that even though it was a fantasy world, that things can get better. That it was a very much a coming of age story for this character, and it helped me in my coming of age journey too. So, and Janie Wurst is a wonderful author. She writes with such heart and such a musicality to her prose and to her books and to her characters and to the settings, that I really took a lot of inspiration from that. I'll never write as good as she does, but that's all right, because I write in my way, she writes in hers. And but just to kind of hold that up as I'm working toward that. That's the idol at the top of the mountain that I'm looking for, and I may never reach that far. But again, that's okay. I'm traveling my own path. So she's probably one of the biggest influences on my writing, just so biggest influences in that she inspired me and showed me what fantasy can do. Because it's on the surface, these books are very, very simple fantasy, but once you get deeper into them, there's so many different layers to it. And her War of Light and Shadows books, I think the 11th book, I think she had 11 books. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But there's so many levels to the books that they start out very simple, but they get very, very deep and very, very intricate. And there are things that are set up in book 1 that are paid off in book 7. So they're really amazing series, and you should definitely go check her out.
Yes, people, check it out. So, Mr. Joel, what are the common tropes found in fantasy novels?
I think you're going to find a lot of them are the chosen one, the basic, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey sort of thing, that the hero's called to do something, to find something, to be something, and in the course of the books and series or single book, that they find their way through to becoming that leader, becoming, a lot of it's, the missing heir to the throne that has to be found. And through the story, the hero figures out that they are the heir, and they become the king that the world, that the kingdom needs. And that's a very basic plot, but there's so many others, and sometimes it's just living in the world and living in it and finding out and going from day to day what's happening, and how these people in these extra worlds work, and how they live, and through the like, for example, Catherine Kurtz's books are the Dearney series, and they start off, they're very it's there's one series that are very much focused on the king and how he become the young boy who becomes the king, but it also goes back, and there's series that start from the very beginning of the series, and how the Dearney race, who are a magical race, become persecuted, and the persecutions that come out from that, and how they fight the persecutions, and how they excuse me, how they hide, and how they try to integrate themselves into the society.
Very well said, Mr. Joel. But before we go on, I want to shout out my listeners in Denmark. Thank you, Denmark, for supporting this podcast, because in capital region, I get 54% audience share. South Denmark at 21, North Denmark at 16, Zealand and Central Jutland. Thank you, Denmark, again for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Joel Flanagan-Grannemann. So,
That's
Mr.
me.
Joel, how important is world building in fantasy novel?
Oh, I think it's one of the most important things. You can't have a fantasy novel without a world to put your characters in, and sometimes it's very deep and very very intricate, but sometimes it can be very simple. Like, I always get praised for my world building, because creating this area where the fairies and humans interact, but it also, I don't see it as that way sometimes, just because I'm just creating this world, and I'm showing it to people in little bits at a time. There's not huge info dumps. That there's not pages and pages of history and all this, how things work, how the government works. So I kind of throw it out there in pieces, in little bit digestible pieces. So, but world building, you can go from very simple world building to intricate, where you have, I know authors who have pages and who have books and books of background, which will never be published, never make it into their books, but they know all this information, so they can add that flavor in to their books. And I know a lot of things about my world, but there are things I'm discovering too as you go. And a lot of authors are sort of like that they have that all that flavor, all that background in their head, and they know about the music, they know about the past. But world building, it's I don't think you can have a fantasy novel without at least some level of world building.
Definitely. So, can you name a famous fantasy series that features an epic quest?
I have one sitting right beside me. This is Tad Williams, his third book in his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. It's his To Green Angel Tower, and this is a huge book. This is was the third book in his series, and it features the epic quest of Simon, who starts out as a scullery boy, and eventually winds up to be king at the end of the third book. And so it's an epic quest. It's three huge books, and I think this To Green Angel Tower was probably the biggest at the time, was the biggest book that Daw printing had ever printed. For the paperback, they had to divide it in two. It was so big. They had to put it into two paperbacks. So it was so big.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Joel. So, how do fantasy novels often incorporate mythical creatures like servants of the moon and sun?
I, I don't really have that many, well, other than the fairies, of course, the mythical creatures. It's sometimes they're very common that they're just strolling down the road, that that there's dragons, there's dragons everywhere. There's unicorns just playing around out there. There's griffins flying around, or sometimes there's fantasy novels where the mythical creatures are more rare, that they're sometimes part of the quest, that you're finding the dragon, maybe trying to find the last dragon, or you're trying or the famous the last unicorn by Peter Beagle. So it really depends on the story and what you're working toward. And I don't have many mythical creatures. It's because I'm more focused on the characters and the fairies themselves. So I mean, it's there are some great books out there with that really focus on the mythical creatures and all these the things that the authors have either borrowed from mythology or created from out of whole cloth. And it's really fun creating your own races of creatures.
Definitely. So, what is a secondary world in the context of fantasy literature?
I really think that's secondary world is like Middle Earth, is like the worlds of that it's like ours, or like for instance, Catherine Kurtz's novels are set in a alternate reality of England. You look at her map, and it's basically England. It's basically England and the European continent, but it's different. It's so that's a secondary world, that you've created something based on your reality, but you have you know changed it around and done things, and you created your own world.
Yes. So, Mr. Joel, how did you create a believable magical system within your servant of the moon and sun?
I took some basic things. I kind of took the basic magic that I really like the idea of, telekinesis, being able to move things with your mind, to be able to pick things up, throw things around, telepathy, being able to speak without speaking, mind to mind with people, and teleportation, being able to move from one point to another without passing. When the teleportation is done through fairy rings in my books. And those were the kind of the three basic ideas for the magic system. But it also bases a lot of ceremonial magic and wards and uh, spell casting, but using through kind of a very ceremonial framework for it, which is a lot of the influence I got from Catherine Kurtz, who uses a lot of pretty much all her journey magic is ceremonial based. That they're casting circles and creating protective wards for with that'll protect them as they do their workings, and creating the wards. So my magic system is kind of soft. That there are basic rules, but there's not any very I don't have very many hard and fast rules. I kind of know what works and what doesn't, and so it's okay. It's a little bit of a blend of both, but it's also it's cool stuff my characters can do.
Yes. So, what is significance of hero's journey in fantasy narratives?
I think the hero's journey is so important because you're putting yourself into the lives of these characters, and you're following them as they figure out who they are. They figure out who they are, who they have to be to uh, to save the world, to save themselves, to save their families. And that hero's journey it's something that pretty much everybody can understand and can empathize with. That they know that basic framework. That it's it's Star Wars, it's Luke's journey, it's it's Jason and the Argonauts. It's the Odyssey. It's that basic. The heroes going from here to here to here, and they're changing, and they're adapting, and they're figuring out the world as they go through it. So it's a very basic. It's very basic, but it can be so. It's so wonderful because it has so much opportunity that you can do so much with that hero's journey. Whether that's some you have these books where the hero is falling, that they're going from hero to villain in the course of their hero's journey, or they're going from villain to hero. So it's there's so many different ways you can play. We can play with that hero's journey, whether you're going going forward, going in reverse, going round and round in circles. It's really fun.
Yes, yes, people, fun, fun, fun in the fantasy novels. But Mr. Joel, before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the executive chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. So please do listen, Food 101. And speaking of Food 101, we are inviting you to please do purchase our Food 101 Volume 1 Basics. It's a culinary course that enhance you to become excellent in the kitchen. So we have already Volume 2 Fundamentals, Volume 3 Principles. So all in all, we have three volumes, a basic that make you a great good cook in the kitchen. So please do purchase Food 101 Culinary Course. So, Mr. Joel, how does the setting of a fantasy novel influence its plot and characters?
I think setting is all is that's the basic. That's your platform that you put your characters in. For example, with mine, it creates this world between humans and fairies, and create that setting, and that's I think that's the most important thing, because your characters can't stand on some. There, I'm sure there are books that pretty much create characters that pretty much just exist in their minds and exist in that world. But most fantasy novels have a strong sense of setting, a strong sense of where this world is and what this world is and what the rules are. So setting is I don't think I could I really had a I had a kind of a basic idea of what the setting was when I started. I kind of more had the characters and their journey and pretty much the idea. But as the book has grown, the setting has grown with it. And a lot of authors will they may have their whole world set up from the beginning, and a lot of authors are kind of discovering it as it goes along. And that's what I'm doing. I'm discovering it as I go along. I know there's some basic landmarks and basic idea of how the world geography works. But again, there's so much room for movement and so much room for uh, improvisation and discovering things as I go.
So, what are the some common themes explored in fantasy literature, as like your servants of the moon and sun?
I think that one of the more common things is the growth of a character. Growing from, like with Janie Worst's books, growing from a boy who knows nothing and is thrust into this magical world, and growing to learn what his skills are, and learning what how he can make a difference in this world. And and there's also the basic quest stories, where you're going from one thing to another, that you're finding the clues along the way, and you're learning about how the how everything how you know how the world fits together. If you're working through like a secondary not a secondary world, like a portal story, where people from Earth, for example, thrust into a fantasy world, and they're discovering that world and how it works and how what they have to do to survive.
So, how do fantasy novels often address the concept of good versus evil?
Hmm. You're asking the hard questions today, aren't you? I, I, the good versus evil is a hmm. Very in the Ted Williams books, in the His Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, there you start out feeling that there's this race of they're like elves. I don't remember exactly what he calls them. They're basically they're a version of elves. They're called something different, and I don't want to mistake and say the wrong name. But you realize they're first portrayed as the antagonists, that they're evil, that they're strange, that they're very otherworldly. And as you go through the book, you discover that there's much more depth to them, that they're not evil, they're not antagonists, they're just different from the humans, and they're trying to live again. They're trying to live their lives and to make to be and to have families and do that sort of thing alongside the humans. So there's that you can turn that the concepts of good and evil on their head, that you can discover something was in the book one looks like evil, looks like you big antagonist, but at the end they're maybe not what you think they are. But there's also books who are very black and white. It's very black and white between who's good and who's evil, and where the hero is and where the villain is. And then there's also the gray areas where you can go through books like the Game of Thrones series, which everybody's a shade of gray there, that you don't really know. It's just kind of based on what they're doing at the time, and who is good and who is evil kind of will switch places throughout the story, and depending on what their motivations are. And the characters can go from doing really good things to doing really horrible things, and it just kind of depends on what that story needs, and where you really how far you're willing to go with those characters.
Certainly, Mr. Joel. So, in the Servants of the Moon and Sun, how would you relate? How you categorize?
How would
You
I cate-
yeah, categorize which genre?
I call it epic fantasy. Some people have called it kind of adjacent to cozy. My wife says it can't be cozy because it has very high stakes in most of the books. But there's elements of cozy in it, because elements of home and hearth and that sort of thing. But I call it epic. Because again, we started out with a very quest-based story. You're going from one thing to another, trying to unlock a mystery of the fairies and and Talia's past. So that's where I'd put it in epic, and that's what I go for in most of my in most of the chapters I write. That there's moments of characters having conversations and talking and just moving from one thing to another, but there's also moments of very high stakes. So that I think that's one of the things about epic, that the stakes are usually very high, that they're usually world shaking stakes.
So, Mr. Joel, what is the role of prophecy in many epic fantasies or series?
Usually, it's very strong. That it's basically that there's some sort of book that has been passed down. For example, this is one of the things that Tad Williams does very well in his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. There's a prophecy that begins, and it goes through almost the whole book, that you think it's one thing, and then it turns itself on its head, and it becomes something totally different by the end of the third book. So prophecy can be one of these MacGuffin things that is always there in the book with your characters, that they're carrying it with them, but sometimes it'll turn itself around and realize that, oh, what I thought was that it'll totally change what. And the thing about prophecy is you never know exactly what it means. that it can mean one thing to one character, it can mean something totally different to another character, and sometimes it's that point of view that really makes the difference on what that how that prophecy works. And that's kind of what I'm one of the things I'm working with in these books is the idea of I'm trying to remember the exact phrase now. It was she who was born on the shore of the sea, who will stand between both sides with a hand out. Stand between sides with a hand out to both, and what that means is, it's really based on what that who's that character is, what character seeing it. It means something to Talia. It means different things to all the characters. So it's one of those um, big big guideposts for fantasy. That's one of those big things that isn't a lot of books, and is handled sometimes very well. That you turn it on its you can sometimes turn it on its head and make things to, well, we were thinking about this the whole for the most of the book, but at the end you realize, oh, it doesn't mean this at all, and it's one of those
Great things.
great things. Yes, yes.
So, what is the impact of folklore and mythology on the fantasy genre?
There's so much you can take from folklore and mythology. You can take so much inspiration, and you can get really deep and really specific with some folklore, that you can go really specific, that and you can get so much um, authenticity out of it by going so deep into a specific folklore, specific stories, and that and you can add so much weight and so much depth to your story by using these kind of basics. Some of them are very basic stories, like, again, Sleeping Beauty is a very basic story. It's a basic, a girl, falls into a coma, essentially. But there's so many things around that story that you can use. Um, for I can't think of one exact thing that I'm using, um, from sleep. Well, the basic framework of Sleeping Beauty, the basic curse, that the curse happens, and why does she curse her own daughter? She doesn't know it's her daughter. But that can, it's there's we could the more the more research you do into your individual culture of folklore, or other people's folklore and mythology, you can add so much depth that it's sometimes amazing what these stories are and how similar they are, but also how different they are.
Certainly. So, Mr. Joel, lastly, what makes a fantasy novel appealing to readers of all ages?
I think it's that ability to put yourself in the shoes of the shoes or boots of that character, to follow their journey, and to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And I really like to get following that character's journey, following that journey from obscurity to becoming a high powered person, or to from going to obscurity to becoming the king, or going from one thing to another. Being able to follow that journey, I think, is really appealing to a lot of people, that they can put themselves in that person's, uh, sometimes into that person's mind, and to follow their thoughts, and to follow their reasoning, and to follow, you know everything that they do. And I think that's the one of the things that, sometimes readers will say, well, the book itself wasn't that great, but I really love these characters, so I read the book because, I wanted to just be with these characters for, 600 pages.
Very well said, Mr. Joel. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, you can go to my website at servantsofthemoonandsun.com. There you can see all my books, all the covers. You can links to buy them. You can buy them in ebook, paperback, hardback, audiobook. The audiobooks are read by my wife, who is also my editor. So we are. I'm as indie as they get. We've done everything in house except the covers. The covers we didn't do ourselves. We hired artists to do those. But everything else, from the writing, which I do, to the formatting, to the audiobooks, to everything else, is all done by just us. So we're as indie as we get. We're as indie as we can get.
Yes, people, let's support indie authors because they are something else. So, Mr. Joel, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
More to come, people. See you soon.